All right, Chad, we have a treat for you today. We are not only interviewing Morgan, we also got the lead encounter designer, Michael Nuthals. And is that hopefully I pronounced that right?
You did, yeah, perfect.
All right, great. And then we have Scott from our guild, who is a tank. I just realized I introduced them for them. I wasn't planning on doing that. That's great. and then Morgan, you guys have we've spoken to him multiple times, so he will be he's going to ask a couple tank related questions, but also just a bit of this interview I think is not as Mythic Plus focused. We really wanted to dive into the raid and some general systems that involve PVE and specifically raid, and Scott will have a lot of insight there. All right, so let's just get it going so we have enough time to get through everything. And in general, I think the first few might be for Morgan, Michael. But we do at the end. I have in my list of things to talk about. At the end, it's just spitball raid design questions, and we just have a million of. I mean, there's so many things I could go into with that I think would be really interesting and a really unique thing to talk about with you.
For sure. Love that.
Cool. All right. So actually, I guess both of you could maybe given there's two.
Recording in progress.
Oh, okay. Recording in progress. Got it. So I think there's two parts of this question. I wonder. I bet maybe one of you can answer one and one and the other. So the gearing system this patch. I noticed Ian actually answered this the other day, and it was pretty. It was. I was surprised at how casual it was because the gearing, how fast you geared this patch compared to other patches was insane. Almost to the point where knowing how you guys like to, err on the side of caution and then nerf a little bit, it just seems so aggressive. I think the exact numbers were something like in the first week when we killed Sarkareth, we had 3.5 eye levels more than we had in the last raid in the second week relative to the raid's eye level, killing Razageth in the middle of the second week. And so it's basically week 1 is equal to what week 4 would have been previously. Just insane as far as if you're doing splits, how fast you can get gear. So knowing that, I just want to ask in general, probably for Morgan, was this the right target? And what can we expect in general from the gearing system in 10.2?
Yeah, totally. So, I guess for the gearing system that we introduced in Embers on Nultharian, speaking to the goals a bit, right, were to kind of create this unified system where previously we had a whole lot of disparate systems, right? Mythic Plus had Valor, or the Outdoor World had multiple versions of upgrades. And actually Raiders didn't have any upgrading at all, right? It was always kind of weird to me that the worst item in my Great Vault was generally perceived to be the raid items because my PvP and Mythic Plus could be upgraded, but raids couldn't. So it was a bit of a problem that we kind of wanted to solve there as well. So, we wanted to address those, and I think we did achieve a lot of our goals, but I think you pointed out very correctly an area where we feel like it definitely could have gone better. We felt that the rate that you kind of finished gearing, especially like you mentioned, people Hall of Fame guilds, people in the race for world first, y'all were kind of done progressing with your gear in the first 3 or even in some cases 2.5 weeks, which yeah, it does feel too fast. Gear progression for us, I talk about this all the time, it's such a critical part of our raid tuning plans, right? We assume that there's actually quite a long tail on your gear progression, so that let's say a month into the raid, if you're progressing naturally and maybe you're on Niltharion and you're hitting a couple road bumps or kind of brick walls that you need to kind of get over, gear is a big part of how we expect those kind of organic nerfs that are so important to RPGs to help achieve that progression. And if your progression is done early on, you're stuck in a position where you're just kind of waiting for the fight to be nerfed, which you might be familiar with, but that's not the position where we want people to be in. So yeah, we definitely feel like there's areas that we can improve there, but ultimately we do think it's a system that we're going to move forward with, and you'll see again in season 3. But I would definitely expect some tuning and some tweaks to happen in that part.
Yeah, great. I mean, also, I just want to point out too, the gearing system, as far as the people that I interact with, I have a lot of people in my chat that do not rate at the highest level. It was very, very well liked. In general, just a huge, great addition to what Valor was. But Michael, I think specifically for you, how did you handle what you thought this raid's difficulty was? Because I know a lot of people, there's so many eyes on the race world first, and it seemed like people were like, oh, this raid is kind of undertuned. It's kind of undertuned. Obviously, there were shorter fights, which we'll get into later. but like, how big of a challenge was it for you dealing with us specifically having so much gear, which was probably the only reason why the raid had like an undertuned feeling to it, and like also compare that to a lot of the other later cutting edge guilds that, you know, outside of Zskarn, which we'll get into later, it was really, the difficulty of the raid was really enjoyed, and it felt like they progressed at a normal rate. So there's like two different, you know, having to always balance between balancing for us and balancing for everyone else. It's a huge challenge. I just want to give you some space to speak about that, and how was it trying to tune this tier with the gear?
Yeah, you know, we set out when we were thinking about how we wanted to kind of approach this tier. We were setting out with kind of like the understanding like we didn't want to have a bunch of fights that we had to make kind of large adjustments to make them killable, especially during the race.
Mm-hmm.
But with, you know, in all difficulties, we wanted to set it out to kind of hit our tuning target. And in a lot of ways, gear kind of like helps us achieve, like Morgan was kind of referencing this a little bit, like there's this like promise of the RPG where like I can go out and get gear, get better,
Mm-hmm.
and progress through the encounter, and we were able to kind of like not have to adjust as many fights over the course of the tier, right? We've almost like a historically few kind of changes to make it progressible. You know, like Morgan was saying, we don't want folks to get to a boss and feel like they're waiting on us to adjust it to be killable, right? We want folks to be able to kind of like engage with the world, do another clear, get that gear, and feel like they're making progress and getting over those raid hurdles that they're running into. So we think about like how gear plays into that. We really want players to have that like chase and be able to like progress their characters over course of time and kind of like self nerf the encounter through their gear acquisition.
All right, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. I think Scott has a question about loot, right?
Yeah, and
Yeah,
just
so-
on that point of Mike's
sorry.
point, you know, like thinking about tuning holistically in the raid,
Mhm.
you know, if I had like a crystal ball and if I could change kind of one thing, I think I would probably, you know, in hindsight, maybe swap Rashok and Magmarax in terms of their
man.
position in the raid. Just from the perspective of like, I think there were more knobs to tune up for Rashok. Like if Rashok was in that same position, I imagine you could see that very quickly turning into like a sludge fist-esque tuning target there. So I think like from a high level tuning, that's probably the one more macro thing I would want to change.
Yeah, I mean, that would definitely. I mean, Rashok is one of the best fights that has ever been made in any game. So yeah, I would definitely agree with that. All right, Scott.
Yeah, so very rare loot definitely took a big change this raid. In season 1, it felt like almost every very rare item was bis for everyone, and actually most of them are still bis now, but they are being nerfed this 0.5 patch. But the response was that, you know, make them less powerful, but they're still like nice to get, and I think it was achieved this raid. But where do you think it goes from here for very rare loot?
Yeah, totally. So we actually made, I would say, two really like big high level adjustments when it came to very rare loot. The first you kind of pointed out, and it was a very intentional design change where in season 1, you know, like you wanted 30 Aeronog rings, right? And 30 icons. But you don't want 30 dragon scales in season 2 right?
Mhm.
So I think that in terms of that design change where we really were looking to create interesting options, you know, an example, I think Neltharion trinkets were pretty close to hitting the mark of what we've aimed for in season where we would aim for in season 3, where they were exciting for some specs and classes, but they weren't like universally, you know, everyone needs this thing. So then when they're very rare, that could create some potential problems there. So in terms of where they're going in season 3, I think we're pretty close to where we would want to be right now in terms of the expected, you know, power or, you know, the who they might appeal to. And the other kind of major thing that we made an adjustment to with season 2 was also just like, how do you get them, right? We kind of increased the chance to get them off of the bosses. Like when you kill the creature and loot the corpse, they're a lot more common there, but then we kind of adjusted the tuning of their drop rate from other sources, right? Like Great Vault, some of the boxes that you get from the weekly events, so they were less likely to come from those sources. So overall, they're still, you know, very rare. We just kind of like shifted the source of where you're going to get them from. So yeah, it's too soon to say if like the very rare loot is something we would carry into future expansions. You know, we still really like the concept and feel like it's hitting a lot of our goals. And there are still problems, but the problems that we've identified, we think those are solvable, and we're going to continue to make adjustments in season 3 with that.
Okay, great. Okay, Michael, I have a big one for you, although I think you both might have some insight on this. So I want to talk about private auras.
Oh.
So this was something that I was actually a huge fan of going into the patch. Anytime you get to a boss, we are a YOLO guild, I guess you could say. We love to just get mechanics, not really think about weak auras, and just figure them out. That is always what we have historically wanted to do. But it just seems like a little bit more likely that if you just make it like machine like a weak aura, it'll just be a little more consistent. So you always do that. So I love the idea of making it so, oh, you know what? It would be easy on Forgotten Experiments for you to just have 3 markers and then you have a weak aura pop on your screen. It says to go to star, diamond, and triangle, and then you do that. But you just made it impossible to do that, which means people have to kind of figure out where they go on their own and actually look at their screen. You know, this is something where weak auras, as good as they are for the game, sometimes the in-fight combat stuff is a little lame in how you play. So you specifically targeted that boss and Neltharion. But I think, as you probably will talk about, it probably had like kind of an unintended effect. Everyone's trying to find a loophole. There's these list weak auras that were just basically like weak auras from 10 years ago that were like super, super hard to follow. Say bubble weak auras and then maps and stuff. So like it was kind of ironic that the fight that was supposed to be like, okay, this would be really cool to have, but like it would have been very difficult to deal with without them. I just want to kind of give you some space to talk about how you felt private auras and your first implementation of them went, and then also where this could go in the future from what you learned this time.
Yeah, awesome. I feel like you articulated our goals better than I ever could. Like, we really want the players to like engage with the game world. We want them to be, focused on communicating with their buddies in the raid and seeing the effects in the game world, and not having add-ons kind of solve the problems for players, right? Like you mentioned, like I get a square over my head and I run to the square marker and I don't have to think about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I execute, right? And that's one of our major goals with private auras, is to move away from that. We want to kind of move away from these like computational add-ons to more informational add-ons, where we think those are kind of okay, where like that list that where you kind of bubble up the folks and you can see who's got it. So it's just like, it's almost like you look at your raid frames and you see who's got the icon on the raid frames. It's just kind of a way of displaying that information. That is less offensive to us than like the problem is solved, right? And we want to make sure that players have to engage with all of their friends and communicate, and we think that creates a more holistic experience of the raid, right? It's more engaging to have to do that. Now, that being said, I think there are lessons learned from, in particular, Volcanic Heart. Like, it was really cool to see, like, watching streams of the Race to World First and you calling out where to go, and who to go where. But I think when we think about where to improve that, it's like, how long does everybody have to like get to their safe spot, like the duration of that aura, or even like how large that rim was, that the area of effect was. And those are things that we will learn. And we also want to like kind of increase, like, if I'm affected with Volcanic Heart, I should be like roiling in flames. There should be a sound effect flaring in my ears. It should be very obvious that something horrific is about to happen to me. And I think there's opportunities for us to kind of amp that up in the future as we kind of continue to think about using these in the future.
No, I actually completely agree. I think you've touched on something really important, where when you have debuffs like that, a lot of people use now weak auras as a debuff bar. A lot of players. And like they'll just customize it because it's just like a debuff. You can make it bigger, you can make it a sound, you can make it transparent, you can make it blink, whatever, right? Just like a little bit more aware. And now in this raid, because of the private auras, they were also kind of, there's a way to like have the private auras show up and you can move that around, but like that was like a little different, at least with sounds and stuff. So you are right. I think having Volcanic Heart 2 things, like the visuals of it and being a little bit worse sound or something that made it a little bit more obvious to your character would have been really good. And I also think that Volcanic Heart took a lot of the heat for that fight specifically because there wasn't really a lot of space to spread. But I imagine in your all's design of Neltharion, you actually thought we were going to break more walls and give more space to make that useful in the entire fight. Is that true? That's just a guess.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons that we chose to make them like in PTR. There was like a line of sight kind of thing, and we just really wanted to make sure we were going to deny a certain amount of space, right? So that's, yeah, absolutely, that we wanted folks to break walls. We wanted to like interact with that whole wall system, and folks, the way folks solved it was awesome. It was super cool to see how that played out. So I loved watching that fight during progress. It was super cool to be a part of.
And just to kind of, you mentioned it a couple times now, Max, but just to be clear, like, those list weak auras that you're mentioning, like when I saw those for the first time, I was like, oh, this is like battleground enemies, you know, the add-on for BGs where it just kind of shows the enemy team. That's definitely not like what we would consider the computational stuff. It's not solving anything for you. That's just kind of bubbling up information in a way that lets you kind of display it the way you want to display it. But then what do you do with that information, right? Like that's the important part that, you know, Mike is really talking about our goals were. The map bit you were talking about, I'm a bit sketchier on that one, you know.
Yeah.
But we'll see what happens with that.
Yeah.
But definitely wanted to talk to an important part of this kind of puzzle for me, which is, you know, ultimately, you know, when we're talking about private auras and weak auras, it's about, you know, like what are the tools that the players have in their tool belt to kind of solve the puzzles that the encounter team is putting in front of them. Weak auras, you could argue, took, you know, kind of removed a tool, but, you know, we felt like that was crossing a bit of a line. But we do feel like it's important for us to add tools to the player's tool belt as well. Like Mike said, there's things that we can do from an affordance perspective, but I think there's also things that we can add to the game. And sure, I'll talk about this. Hopefully I don't get in trouble. In 10.1.7, we're actually adding a ping system, right? So something that you might be familiar with from like Dota, League of Legends, Apex, stuff like that.
That is so sick.
Where there's a ping system that has like kind of contextual pings where you can really quickly on the fly kind of communicate.
Wait, like so not on your map, you can see it in game. That is insane. That is actually insane.
Yeah, and it'll have different options, and you know, you'll be able to put it in the world or on a player or on an enemy. So, you know, giving players that tool to more quickly communicate, and you know, if we give you great affordance, you know, this is not only something that could be great for guilds, but also we think it's an important accessibility option, right? We love watching guilds who get, you know, are participating in the raid content who might have some accessibility concerns. So that's something that we're adding that we think is important for people to be able to solve these problems that we're creating for them.
That is so good. I could unpack. I want to get to everything we have, but that is so good, not only for guilds that have accessibility issues, but also even at the highest level. That is something that will allow, and it's directly in game. It's not a weak aura. It is someone telling someone else to do something, and it's just a little bit more visual. That is really, really cool. Okay,
yeah, it'll be fun for Mythic Plus pugs and stuff too. Like we're excited about that, and
where are you gonna pull the mobs to? And then as the tank is running to group them, he pings where he's pulling the mobs to. You know, not to hit them until they get there. Seriously, it has like a ton of application. Okay, Scott has a very unique question that I'm really glad Michael is here to maybe give some insight into.
Yeah, so even though tanks only make up 10% of the like mythic raid group, like how big is a factor in like raid design is tanking? Like, is it boss by boss dependent, or is it usually towards the later stage of like designing a fight? Because some of the best bosses of all time have almost fully relied on tank movement. That's like Zakul, Saya Denafria, Zashara, and it almost appears that it was designed around tanks. So if you could speak to that a little, that would be great.
Yeah, I'd love to. This is like my favorite part of my job is when we get to think about bosses in their earliest conceptions. And one of the things we love to do is to let the individual designers who are responsible for the encounters kind of have the freedom to kind of explore how to best sell the fantasies of these different encounters and to make sure all of the different roles are engaged. So it really does come down to kind of a boss over boss kind of thing. Like a designer might have a really great idea of how to engage tanks and really sell the fantasy of an encounter, and they would go off and implement that and, you know, really highlight tanks in this encounter, just as another designer might have an awesome idea to like really engage healers and make an encounter that's really shining a light on them. What we want to see over the course of the raid as a whole, though, is kind of like everybody has a chance to shine at one time or another, whether you're a tank, a healer, a DPS, and even more specifically, like AoE specs versus single target specs have a chance to shine, both healers and DPS, right? We want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to kind of have their turn in the spotlight when we're thinking about a raid as a whole.
Yeah, and I also want to kind of call something out that you noted there. You know, all the bosses that you listed, Zakul, Denathria, Sajara, it's not a coincidence that they're like much later in the tier, right? Because like ultimately tanks can be a singular point of failure for a group, right? Like I think we've all been in a fight where we're just kind of waiting for the tanks to figure out the mechanics before like the rest of us are essentially allowed to start progression, right? Like, all right, tanks, get this sorted, please, because we're kind of stuck here. So we have to be really careful when creating situations like that, especially early in the raid. So while those are really fun mechanics, it can, if we're not careful or depending on where those mechanics are present, can kind of block guilds much earlier in the progression than might be the target for us. So yeah, that's definitely a factor when we're talking about those types of tank mechanics as well.
That's good. Also, just to follow up on that, like, who decides how hard a boss hits? Like, does it depend on their sword, or like, how is Neltharion and Denathrius? Like, those bosses are crazy. They're almost one-shotting tanks with melee swings, and then there's some other bosses that maybe don't hit hard at all. Is that again fight by fight? Is it?
Yeah, it all comes down to texture. Some encounters are, very tank centric. We want to kind of focus a little more on tank healing. You'll notice that those encounters tend to hedge towards the back half or later encounters, because those are the opportunities where like we expect tanks to be really fluent in how they use their defensive cooldowns, and there we start relying on like the whole team has to participate. You're looking for externals to the external defensive cooldowns from your healers and other members of the raid to help the tanks survive through it. And we add that like level of coordination as you get deeper into the raid tier. So yeah.
Yeah, there's a whole like on this, how much kind of auto attack damage is what we call it is happening to tanks. There's a whole separate conversation we could have here because like, we talked about this, or I've talked about this quite a bit with the combat team of like, tank healing is a thing. That's a strength of some healing roles. We always used to think about holy paladins way back in the day as like, all right, you're the tank healer, or you throw your earth shield on the tank. And just how far we've moved into tanks are completely self-sufficient and almost don't require any like bandwidth. That's definitely a topic that I think we talk about internally, but that's more of like a combat thing than an encounter thing. But that definitely, that relationship between combat and encounter is very much comes to light in these later bosses, which is also sometimes why you see that number getting cranked. They're like, we want you to heal the tank. Just keep cranking till you heal the tank.
Oh, that's
actually like like an internal test that we do at the start of every expansion is like, all right, a singular tank, how long can you tank this boss, and how much do we have to crank its melee damage, and how did that compare to last expansion? Hey, combat team, did you know this thing is doing this much auto attack damage and the tank is fine? Are we cool with that?
Yeah, I think that's changed a lot in this game, because I know for a long time in the past, like, I mean, in the oldest days, it was actually just like syncing up different cast time finishes of like single target heals onto a tank so they don't die. Like, I'm talking way back in the day. I think now, at least at optimal play, like most tank healing is done like that, but it's done differently. Like you said, it's holy paladins, but it's not casting that spell. It's having beacon on the tank, or it's or it's resto druids or other healers always making sure they have their hot on the tank, and that is the healing they need, but not that they're totally self-sufficient. So yeah, I think it's done in a different way. I think tank healing is more interesting to figure out if tanks do need healing, right? And on fights where they don't, or you can get away with it, or you can make your comp different around it, you can maybe use those externals on DPS players who are soaking this one mechanic, right? So like those kind of decisions are really interesting. So I wanted to ask you guys about boss length. So I think something in this tier that is super different is the bosses are much shorter in than they have in other raids, and specifically near the end boss. I remember when we were looking at Sarkareth initially, we were like kind of doing the math in our heads. Obviously, we don't get to test that fight, and we're like, this is like a 9-minute, like this is going to be like a sub 10-minute fight. And we haven't gotten those in a while, actually. I think historically, at least modern WoW, the only two end bosses I can remember that were sub 10 minutes were Blackhand and Denathrius, I think, besides like the main raids, which are, they're all-time great, top 5 on almost anyone's list. So I was really excited for Sarkareth for that reason. We kill this boss at 7.5 minutes. Completely just a huge departure from what most people would expect. I think it was very well liked. Certainly was from us. I just kind of, what was the thought process behind doing that? It's a big swing. Do you feel like it went well? And do you like the concept behind making shorter end bosses, or shorter, harder bosses in general?
Yeah, I could speak to that a little bit about kind of our inspiration was... I remember I was sitting down with the designer who was working on Sarkareth, and we were talking about encounters we'd done in the past that we really liked, and we were like, I really loved Blackhand because it felt like it was like it hit the gas immediately and didn't let up until Blackhand was on the ground and you were looting him. And we're like, how do we make a fight now that could kind of, echo back to that as a source of like inspiration? And that's kind of where we got like this like 7 minutes in heck encounter, right? We're just like, you gotta, it's hectic. It starts at 11 and only gets higher from there, and it's just all about that, like kind of executing for just a really finite amount of time. I was really pleased. It was awesome watching the race. It was really cool to see like kind of a shorter encounter. I do think there's a little bit of an aspect here of like, one of the things we want to see kind of happen, especially on the end bosses, is to have a little bit more attrition over the course of an encounter, to really let, especially like the race to world first, to let folks kind of like differentiate like who's the best, right? Like really like create that gap and show like, yeah, like we're really, really great. I really love to have seen the fight maybe be a little longer to help tax like just all the guilds that were going through it, right? At the same
I think
time,
especially P2. I think that
Yeah.
was the one thing that could have been drawn out a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of like I would have loved to have seen it just a little longer, but I kind of largely agree. I enjoy an encounter that is like, because really, ultimately, an encounter is an opportunity to tell a bunch of story through combat, right? And some stories take longer, and some stories take less time, and we want to make sure we're finding the right kind of appropriate amount of time to tell the story we want to tell through the combat mechanics, and to really feel like players feel like they've been able to have their fill of the encounter, right? They've had the right amount.
Yeah, and I guess just adding two things. One, super random fun fact: the inspiration for Blackhand was actually Siege Crafter Black Fuse. So like going back to MOP, right? Like Siege Crafter Black Fuse was also one of those ones that was short but super intense and really fun. So that was, when the team was working on Blackhand, we were talking a lot about that one. And then second, I guess this gets to your point, and Mike was just talking about this too. Like ultimately, I would say, if we're thinking about like a range of end bosses in time and how much their average duration is, I wouldn't say 730 is like the new benchmark. I think this is, though, I would say a kind of indication of that scale shifting down, right? Like I think 10 minutes is kind of something that we think of. Okay, 10 minutes is towards the top of that band where we would want to see the boss duration go. Certainly like 15-minute fights. If Mike and the team came to me and was like, we would make a 15-minute fight, I'd be like, make it 2 fights. So yeah, I think that just kind of speaks to, kind of philosophy shifting and things changing over time. So yeah.
No, I mean, that totally makes sense. I mean, you kind of landed that by understanding where the fights are, right? You said Sarkareth. I feel like there could have been a little bit more to actually figure out a little bit more attrition. That would have been closer to 10 minutes. And then I could also point out multiple 14-minute fights, 13-minute fights, which has kind of been the norm for a couple years, where you could probably take one small phase out of that or one portion of that fight, add that difficulty to something else, like you said, getting the gas revving right away. And I just think the quality of that is so much better. And a lot of things is like artificial difficulty. You're doing a boss for 14 minutes, and part of the reason that it is hard is because you have to do it for 14 minutes. And I think removing that and adding the real organic difficulty back into the fight feels a lot better.
Yeah, and like Mike said, a lot of that really does come back to what is this kind of story we're trying to tell, right? And like I imagine most people think of like Sylvanas. That was a pretty long encounter where, in hindsight, could we have done something like we did with N'Zoth, where it was like Carapace and then N'Zoth themselves, and split that kind of story of like, all right, you're at the top of, Torghast and you're progressing across the chains, and maybe that's one encounter, and then there's a separate encounter that starts after that, right? Like those are the types of things we've talked about recently.
Okay. And I know we are near the end of the interview now, or we're at the end, but usually I can trick you into answering a few more questions. Are you willing to answer like one or two more? What's up to you?
I got one more. Yeah.
One more. Okay, we have to pick. Scott, I think doing what you were planning on doing is a good way to tie this up.
Yeah, sure. So this is 2 bosses I would like to speak on for the question, both Zskarn and Sarkareth. But did the bosses die the way that you kind of expected? I mean, when you make these bosses, I'm assuming you have like an idea of how they're going to die. But like with Zskarn, like for us, that fight was amazing, even though that's pretty controversial. Like for us, like we kind of filled the room up, ran to this one safe spot and did the last few percent in that safe spot. But then, people started doing like, 10% of the boss's health, 20% there, but like, and then also with Sarkareth, like, did you, 100, yeah. But then also with Sarkareth, like, did you expect the entire raid to go down in the last phase and have the tank kind of like, be that guy that if he dies, the encounter resets? Were those expected outcomes?
Yeah, I can actually speak to both of those. Yeah, actually, both of the ways that we saw during the race to world first, those first couple of kills of both those bosses were as we kind of intended. Sarkareth, we intended the designer intended folks to use going down to help avoid some of those critical moments in the encounter. And I know Zskarn, we had this thought of like, yeah, wouldn't it be awesome if you ended the kind of like a fight in the phone booth for like the last couple of percent, because the whole room is full of fire and we only have this like tiny little space to handle all these mechanics. That was exactly kind of how we envisioned those encounters playing out.
All right, sweet. Man, well, as usual, I wish I could. I mean, we had like a spitball raid design questions. We got pretty much all the way to the end. I could pick your brain about fights and stuff. We think about this stuff all the time. And it's like part of our job is we have to kind of. Things change week to week in PTR, right? Like we have to think where you're going with a fight. If we test a fight super early and you're like, damn, this is missing something, we have to try to figure out what you think is missing and then kind of prepare for that for the next time. So
yeah, totally.
So obviously it'd be super fun to do that. Actually, sorry.
I do want to speak a little bit to because I imagine there's like the second part of this Zskarn question, which is what happened
sure.
there.
Yeah, we should talk about that a little.
I can speak to that a little bit. Right. So
sure.
like, the finishing the fight in the phone booth, right? Very much was the intended way that the fight would end. But there was the strategy that basically became, well, but what if we sat in the phone booth for the whole fight?
Mm-hmm.
And like, ultimately, I think we made a change to that. We made it midweek. I think I can say first we should have been much faster to fix that strategy in particular.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't as agile as we should have been. And when we did decide to change it, we actually kind of treated it less of like a tuning change and more of like an exploit change, which is why we changed it midweek, right? But I think in hindsight, I think we could have dealt with that better. I think in reality, again, speaking about crystal balls, we could have fixed it on reset and then done something like turned off your ability to extend that week or something like that, right? Because I know there was a lot of conversation around like, well, if you beat it this way, you can extend, and that caused some kind of unfairness there, which was not ideal. So we could have done better there. And ultimately, a lot of this also speaks to the problems that we were talking about earlier with gearing, right? Like normally extending, because I think we caught it, relatively quickly. It was only a couple weeks in. Normally extending that early in a new raid tier would be extremely punitive for your eye level. But because the gearing system was so fast, extending that early, because your gear was already pretty saturated, wasn't actually that big of a penalty, which meant Sarkareth was in striking distance there. So it was kind of a, quite a few problems kind of converging in one. And ultimately, I just wanted to throw that out there because I imagine that would be the unspoken question.
Awesome. That is, yeah. I mean, I did want to get into that, yeah, especially because of the extended thing. All right, I think that's all the time we have. I just want to ask either of you what your favorite end boss of all time was.
Go ahead, Morgan. You can go first.
I can't, because that's like choosing my favorite child. Like, you mean like that we worked on, or that just generally?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just a boss you've done where you're like, man, this is a masterpiece. This is insane.
Preface, no one person makes an encounter on their own, right? The World of Warcraft team is very collaborative. There's a ton of people that are involved in it. I don't think it's fair to really call out this thing that I did, because it's ultimately the entire team that does it. So yeah, we can talk later.
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, we talked about one of the ones that would be on my list today, though.
Okay, sweet.
We'll go that far.
All right, I love hearing that. All right, thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you guys for the time, and thanks Scott again for coming on.
Yes.
Yep, and Michael, have not had a chance to talk to you before, but as I said before, I'm pretty sure I could talk to you for like 8 hours about raid fights. So
yeah, anytime you want to jam on raid fights, I'd love to come back and talk to you.
all right, sweet, love that. All right, thanks
later.
guys.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.